Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you tonight. Thanks for the introduction. By far, I just saw the number of individuals who are joining this presentation. By far, this is the largest group that I've been presenting to, which is great. I appreciate that, your interest for budgeting. So, I can't hear. I don't know. Okay, sorry. So we're going to try to be brief. There's a lot to cover in this presentation. The agenda, I'm going to be talking about the budget overview, operating budget, and from that point, Mr. Senami will take over so the budget process, public safety, and we'll both handle questions at the end of the presentation. So just to start, what is potentially a one-on-one concept of what the budget is composed by it has two components, the operating budget and the capital budget. Think about the capital, which we're going to talk about in a second. Capital is all the infrastructure that the city has and maintain. We talk about recreation center, for example, or the pipes that are running through the conduits or water system. Those are capital projects, or that's what the capital project focus on. On the other hand, the operating side is all the expenses that are related to personnel or providing the one-on-one services to our residents and visitors. Another example right here, as I mentioned, the public, the infrastructure, which is related to pipes in this case, and the operating side will be, trash pickup and alley cleaning and those type of services. So that's the overall, just to have some distinction what the capital and the operating budget are. So in how the budget is prepared, it's under the finance department entirely. We are responsible for putting the budget together every year. Budget needs to be balanced, and we have to make the means in comparison of revenue, how much revenue come in and how much expenses in order to balance that budget for the other two components, sub-components of the entire budget, which is as I mentioned, the operating side and the capital. The operating side is managed by BBMR, which is the bureau where I work specifically as assistant budget director. The way we manage the budgets is we interact directly with agency. We are responsible for making sure that the expenses in any given year are at a target, and also monitoring revenue, which is a specific side that I manage. On the other side is the capital, which is managed by the planning department. But both of them are the finance department is responsible for putting together citywide. Now let's talk about the operating budget. I think this presentation is less focused on the capital side, so I think it's more important for the audience of this group what happened on the operating side, and that's why we tailor this presentation to talk a little bit more on this end. So the operating side is, it has three components. The main component is what we normally know and hear is the general fund. The general fund is where we basically provide most of the services the city has in terms of for his residents. So we have revenue collections, we have policing, we have fire department, health department. All these are funded by the general fund in its majority. There are some specific areas in those services that are funded by other ways of funding. It could be a special fund or federal grants, but most of these services are funded by general fund. And when I talk about general fund, I'm gonna mention a little bit later, those what are those revenue sources that specifically generate those revenues to provide those services. I'll mention in a second. So the other portion of the budget of the operating side will be the enterprise fund. And I know Maytan has a nice display in his background about water. Those are the ones that are related to the enterprise. Will be sewer fund or the water fund, the stormwater fund. Those are considered enterprise because they are entirely responsible for generate revenues to pay their services. There's no connection between those services and what the general fund. The only connection is a specific some type of overhead for the purpose of revenue collection, for example, that the general is funded through the general fund, but it's a service that is provided citywide. So the enterprise fund pay a portion of those costs to this general fund. And the other one is the grant fund. I'm sorry, I flipped the order. I should have mentioned the grant funds earlier. The grant funds are restricted funds, meaning that we get funding sources from either the state or federal or special sources, and those needs to be are committed for a specific service, cannot be used for other purposes, which is the difference between the special funds and the general fund. General fund is for everything that the city provides services on. For fiscal 2022, which is the year that just started a week or so, 2 weeks ago, the total budget, operating budget is 3.8 billion. That money is backed up by revenues, as I mentioned before, and is split in the three revenue sources for each of these categories. Where the money come from? Now we're going to talk specifically about the general fund. The general fund is where most of the taxes that the city collects are. Most of the charges for services, most of the some of the penalties and some of the income that come from the state that are not restricted for specific purposes go there. So as you can see on this table, almost 70% of the general fund comes from two revenue sources, which is the property taxes, which include personal property tax as well, and income tax. The property tax in this chart is net of almost $120 million in tax credits that the city also offered. In terms of the income tax rate as of now is at the maximum that we can charge, which is equivalent to many other jurisdictions in the states at 3.2%. Other revenue sources that we have that are meaningful for this chart is state highway user revenue, which is a revenue that comes from the state, but is I mean to pay the city for maintaining or routes specifically. It's collected by, there are 5 different revenue components for the state highway user revenue, and we get that money on the monthly basis, but it's not restricted for specific, well, it's restricted only for maintenance of the routes and public transportation. So that's the only restriction that the highway user revenue has. The reason why it's in the general fund is because the expenses for those particular items are way higher than what we receive from the state. So it becomes a line item that is funded for other sources in the general fund. Just to give a little more details, other items in this chart, we have state aid. State aid specifically is for what is called the disparity grant, and is mandated by the state, and we get around $100 million per, actually $80 million. There are other sources on that line item, but $80 million from the state, which is intended to make the average income of the residents equivalent to 75% of the state average. And we get that money, is legislated by the state, that we get this money on the annual basis. There are other sources of revenue that we have, other local taxes, telecommunication tax, energy taxes that are also included in the general fund. Just to display a little bit how important and what the trend in the property tax has been. As you can see, from 2013, we've been growing almost 30% since then. We are accounting now for almost it's actually a little bit more than $1 billion in property taxes, which again includes personal property taxes as well. Let's see what else here. Yeah, so and it is net of the homestead tax rate. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a benefit that caps property owners increases higher than 4% annually in property tax. One of the issues which I don't display here, but one of the issues we always hear is why the property tax in the city is so high, and among other explanations is the large amount of exempt property that the city hosts. We have almost 30% of the accessible base in the city is completely exempt. That means that we have federal and state and local buildings, as well a very large number of nonprofit organizations within the city. Just to have an idea how much that represents, and we understand that the value that nonprofit have for development in general for the city, but just to give some sense of how much the city is not able to materialize in revenues due to the large amount of exempt properties, about $370 million that the city doesn't get. That's just for context. And you can see the map where all these exempt properties are in the city. And another item just for illustration, we are just behind Montgomery County in statewide in terms of the amount of untaxable accessible base across the state. Now talking about income tax, we've been very surprised at how the income tax has been trending in the last years, especially when we know that we have been losing population, but income tax has been one of the strengths in recent years, one of the strongest sources of revenue and reliable sources of revenue in, even in situations that we just encountered through the pandemic. Income tax has been responding well for as a revenue source for the city, and we are investigating and researching just to make sure that this revenue source continues and is legitimate what we have been receiving in recent years. Again, it's one of the second largest revenue source for us. Now talking a little bit about what the budget is structured, and Bob is gonna enter in just in a few minutes just to go more in detail in the schedule and talking about public safety. But the mayor's prepares the budget based on 5 priority outcomes, which are displayed on the screen right now. These priorities include multiple indicators that are used at the agency and by our department to track expenses and make sure that we accomplish based on outcomes what the budget is intended to do. So every year we go through the exercise of selecting priority outcomes, and those we track those outcomes through the year, and those are the relevant items that are connected to the services that the city provides, and is how we establish the budget. So as you can see on the screen, there are 5 priority outcomes, and there is a display of some of the indicators for each of the outcomes that are related to these priorities. Obviously, if we talk about public safety, which is the one in the middle, those are related to the services that specifically relates to police or fire or the mayor's office of criminal justice. If we talk about cleaning and healthy communities, that will be the services that the city has for provided by the health department or Department of General Services in general. When we talk about equitable neighborhood development, that will be what we do with a housing department or services provided by housing department. So again, all these services have indicators, and that's how we track expenses and how we track how well we're doing in terms of all the expenditures in the budget side. This is another way to see how the operating budget is split by priority outcome. Again, as I mentioned before, this includes all funds. So this is $3.8 billion, what the fiscal 2022 includes the enterprise fund, the general fund, and the special fund, which is federal, state, and all. Now, fixed costs. This is a very important component of the budget because this we are restricted. We don't have a lot of flexibility to reduce in the short term or modify these costs which is a very large component of the operating expenses. what are the fixed costs? Well, that includes contribution to the employment pension, healthcare retirees, payment of debt service, and other items there. Those items are not easily modifiable in the short term, because they'll require labor negotiations and some type of negotiations that cannot be done immediately. So it takes time for those to be restructured. But we have been successful in the prior years to at least keep it in a level that is, it freed up resources in order to use for for funding other services, not necessarily related to this item. For comparison, this is a trend, and that precisely shows some milestone that we reached with some of the negotiation that we did for pension and health restructuring. As you can see, the top part is the revenue line, and we are trying to, and the bottom part is the fixed cost through the years. And as you can see, we have been able to lower from early in 2010, it was about 46, 47%. We have been able to reduce to 45, and the goal is to keep it that way. And again, this goal is specific to free resources in order to be able to fund other services. I'm not sure how much, how well I'm doing in time. Okay, so let me go back. This is, just to clarify something in this chart, if you might recall in the prior figures that I shared with you, it said the general fund was $2 billion, $2.01 billion. The difference here is that this is referencing only to the operating side. We also budget for PAYGO, and for fiscal 2022, it's about $15 million. So that's the main difference. And this is just for just showing going back to the split between fixed costs and how it is structured for the general fund in general. So I'm gonna stop right now, and I'm gonna let Bob to take the lead and talk about the budget process. And again, I'll be available by the end of the presentation to answer questions or probably clarify anything that you might have not been clear on my end.
Okay, thanks, Pedro. So from this point, we just wanted to share first, just to show you timeline-wise what the overall budget process looks like. There's a lot of attention to the budget. Usually you'll hear a lot about it in April or May. There's a time where we release the budget to the public. There's a public input into the process, into the budget, and then we have to go get it passed by the city council. But actually the planning process starts way well before that. Even this chart doesn't do justice. We're actually starting, looking ahead to fiscal 23, which is the year that starts next July. We've already started thinking about that now, and it's only July. But basically how the process flows is that we develop in the late summer, early fall, what we're calling November here, what we call a CLS level budget. CLS stands for current level of service. So we try to figure out, even projecting ahead, what will it cost next year to do just the same things we're doing today? And the CLS budget is almost always larger than the last year's budget, because there are things like inflation that have to get built into the budget. If folks who've been following the news, there's a little bit higher inflation right now than we're used to, partly because of the disruption from the pandemic. We have to build in sometimes cost increases for things like cost of living adjustments for city employees and other things. So we're always kind of starting with what's our baseline for next year, and then going from there. We're also identifying, the mayor's office is working with us on what Pedro had shared, those 5 priority outcomes. Somebody had asked in the chat, who chooses those outcomes and indicators. It's largely the mayor and his or her team kind of get together and look at those indicators. They don't change too much from administration to administration, but there are times that they want to put their mark on something or shift the emphasis from one thing to another. Once we get into the fall, into November and December, city agencies actually submit budget proposals back to finance. From January to March, we're evaluating those proposals, going through them, making sure we understand them, and then ultimately we have to make a recommendation to the mayor. Once we've decided on what is in the budget for the year, we first release in March what we call the preliminary budget. And that's probably the first time the public hears much about it. Everything before then is what we call pre-decisional. It's still being kind of planned behind the scenes. And in March is when we release that first part of the budget. In April, the Board of Estimates holds hearings on the budget, and we also hold what we call a taxpayer night. That's an opportunity for citizens to come and voice their pleasure or displeasure with any part of the budget. We heard from folks pretty loudly this year on certain aspects of the budget. I wouldn't say that every bit of citizen input makes its way into the budget. The mayor ultimately has to decide what he or she thinks is good feedback that he wants to change or not. And so what we do open ourselves up in that April timeframe to hear from folks. And that's not just the public. We'll hear from city council folks. We'll hear from other elected officials. We'll get a lot of feedback about the budget. And then in May, we have to make a decision of what we ultimately present to the city council. So the Board of Estimates approves the recommended budget in May. It goes to the council, and then the council holds their own hearings on the budget process. And then in June is when the council reviews and passes the budget. So just wanted to give folks a flavor of what that process looks like. I would say, there's two spots where we're reaching out and welcoming the public on, to engage in the process. By law, we're required to do these, and I think they're good steps. One is in April at that first taxpayers night, and then the council holds a similar event before they review the budget. I often get asked by people, well, at that point, isn't the budget already complete? Well, not really. I mean, when the budget gets released in March, it is not that preliminary budget. It is not complete. When we're doing that first taxpayers night, we as an office have not submitted the final budget to the council yet. So there have been times where we've presented a preliminary budget, and then based on the feedback we get from residents, we have made changes to the budget before we present it to the council. That doesn't happen every year necessarily, but it has happened, and it does happen. There are other steps that we're trying to do to get a little bit more engagement in the process that we're in the works right now is getting ready to do a citizen survey, which is one way to get input. And we also do these types of workshops, of course, too, where we're hearing feedback from residents, and of course the mayor is going to various events where he or she is hearing from folks as well. Moving on to the next slide, if you would, Pedro. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about public safety because I know that's a hot topic, and I want to start with we'll go through two things really. First, I just want to talk about some of the realities of public safety funding, how it works, and what we've seen in terms of trends in our budget. And then I want to close by talking about some of the improvements that we've seen over the past few years. I'll tell you up front, the police budget was for a long time was a disaster, frankly. There was not a lot of control over it. There was not a lot of compliance. We had, kind of a revolving door of police commissioners, a lot of instability in the department. I will say that over the past 2.5, 3 years, with Commissioner Harrison, there's more stability in the department, and I think there are some improvements that I want to share with folks that we've seen from our perspective, finances perspective, where they've gotten a little bit better. But first of all, just for the facts, in terms of public safety funding, I'm often asked, well, why is the police budget so large to start with? And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that in the U.S., public safety funding is largely seen as a local issue. So we get very little in terms of state, federal, or other funding for public safety. For other priorities, things like, social services or employment development, there is a lot of federal aid that gets distributed to local governments. On public safety, not so. It's generally seen as a local issue. So, in our fiscal 22 budget, our general fund budget for police was over 500 million, and collectively the grants were only about $20 million or so. So the general fund generally has to pick up most of the cost. The second thing is that the staffing coverage that's required for public safety is around the clock. And so sometimes I think folks forget about this. When I get done my job's generally more of a 9 to 5 kind of job. And when I leave, nobody comes to back me up and be the budget director overnight. That's not true in public safety. We have to staff around the clock. So, whereas a normal civilian position works 1 8-hour shift, we have to staff 3 8-hour shifts per day for public safety. I mean, the third thing is that there are, we've always felt that there's some kind of baseline minimum staffing levels that we need to just be able to respond to all of the calls for service. So, just some data here, we get millions of calls every year, over $1 million 911 calls. And, generally our citizens demand, when they call 911, they want somebody to be there pretty quickly. So we have to make sure we staff a level so that we can respond to those calls. Now, I'll say later, we're trying to make some improvements. We don't have to send a police officer to every call. That's one thing that a lot of cities, including Baltimore, have been looking at, is diverting certain calls to more, better trained people, which we are looking at. But for, a fire emergency, we've got to send a fire truck. For an EMS emergency, we have to send somebody with that skill. And for a call that it is some kind of conflict or violence, we have to send a police officer to those. And then finally, the salaries due in the marketplace too just tend to be higher for public safety workers versus other laborers, so to speak. And like an entry-level police officer salary is about $55,000 for Baltimore. That's even lower than some of the other surrounding jurisdictions, where an entry-level labor in like the public works department that's riding a trash truck, for example, is only $32,000. That's kind of more market driven. That's the reality if you want to hire those people into the city. So that's one. And then, in terms of the budget itself, a large portion of the budget is comprised of just basically personnel costs and other fixed costs. So, personnel costs, we have to pay the salaries of the officers that we have. There are generally cost of living adjustments each year for not just police officers, but all city employees if we can afford it. There are also sometimes some things that are built into our contracts with those unions that will require additional costs. One thing that I've heard folks say before as well, the police budget's grown from $200 million in fiscal 10 to $500 million in fiscal 22 or thereabouts. And one thing that we changed is that in 2014, we shifted pension costs into all of the agency budgets. And the reason for that is that even though the city centrally makes up contribution for pension costs for both civilian and police and fire employees, we decided to allocate those costs into the agency budgets. And that meant that in fiscal 14, we went from only budgeting a couple of dollars in each of those agencies to tens of millions, and now over $100 million of cost in the police budget for pension. So that's one that we adjust for when we look at the long-term trends. And overtime, like I mentioned earlier, was a big problem for the last decade, but the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of improvement, which I'll touch on in a moment. On the next slide, this is actually, if we take out those pension costs, which we consider a fixed cost, the growth in our budgets, when you look at police and fire versus others, it's actually probably surprising to folks. Fire department, you can see, has grown over this 10-year period, 33%. Police has grown 25%, and all other services have grown 54.6%. So again, a lion's share of the cost in the police budget is the pension cost, and pension costs are more expensive for public safety than they are for civilian employees. Another thing that has been a challenge for Baltimore is, and this does relate to overtime, is that we have to aggressively go out and hire enough police officers to keep up with the level of service that the public demands. You can see here that we've had 3 or 4 out of the last 6 years, we have net lost police officers. And what that means is, if you lose a police officer and you want to still maintain the service level, sometimes we need to use overtime to staff those slots. Because again, we feel that there's a bare minimum level that we need to staff just to respond to the service calls. And so you can see this has been a trend where we've net lost more people due to retirements or separations than we've been able to hire. This is a trend around the country. If you've been reading, if you've been following the news recently, a lot of police departments are really struggling to hire. And, part of this, I think, is because there was a big reckoning, frankly, right, last summer and about, the role of public safety and what was going on. And I think it exposed, a lot of major problems in the way our police departments are run. What it also has meant, though, is there are a lot more scrutiny on police officers now, which I think there should be. but that has meant that it's a lot harder to hire people into these roles because of that scrutiny. And I think, hopefully, I think that's a disruption. I think that's a good thing that there's more scrutiny, but it has made it harder in the short term to hire. Next, on the next slide, just a couple things about the progress on the budget. I'll just, in the interest of time, let me start in fiscal 20, because that is fiscal 20 is the year that the new commissioner started. So starting in 20, we were able to implement a new FOP contract, and that allowed us to generate some overtime savings. So our patrol schedule was not the most efficient. It required more officers than we thought was necessary. We made a change there, and we're able to generate $5 million of savings just from that change. We also converted some sworn positions to civilian positions, which I'll touch on in a moment. And we did start to upgrade in the capital budget some of our IT equipment and our police radios, which were long out of date and needed to be improved. In fiscal 21 was the year, this was a year where we reduced the police budget in current service terms. So the overtime budget was reduced by $13 million. We eliminated the mounted police unit. Those are the horses, if you've seen them. We also eliminated the Marine unit, which is a unit that patrolled the Chesapeake Bay and the surroundings, which was we felt was not a super important unit, either of those units. We also moved the central district to a newer, more modern and efficient building, and we abolished 37 positions in the department. So fiscal 21, that was when we had COVID-19. The city was in a position where we were looking for cuts, and the police department got cut pretty significantly in 21. And again, I think all those things were probably, some of them were long overdue, frankly. And we don't think that they've really, we don't really think that there have been an impact from those cuts. Now in fiscal 22, if you remember, if you're following the news this year, there was a lot of noise about, well, the police budget went up, but this year was unusual in that we didn't add any service for new police officers or new police service. This was just all the cost drivers of things like pension costs, workers' compensation costs, and our healthcare plans. The cost of all those things increased in fiscal 22. And there were increases on all city agencies for those things. These costs get allocated to the city agency budgets. But in 22, that happened to hit all agencies pretty hard, and especially the police department. Next, in terms of things we've done, I mentioned earlier, I wanted to just, in closing, kind of shift to say, here's some things that have improved from our perspective. So, one is, our perspective has been, a sworn police officer is a valuable resource. We have to use that person to the best of their abilities. We had a problem in our department, frankly, where there were too many sworn officers that were doing like professional work or things that could be done by a civilian. That's things like finance, IT, human resources, equipment, procurement, things of that sort, just a general administrative jobs. And we found that it's kind of baked into the police culture that people see it as kind of a reward. Like if they work on the streets for 15 years, that they get to kind of retire to more of a civilian position. But we feel strongly that we can't afford to do that. That's expensive for the city. So what we've been doing over the past couple of years, especially in 2020, you'll notice in 21, we went from from fiscal 2019 to 2020, we swapped out, we reclassified 62 positions from sworn to civilian. And for sworn people that were doing those administrative tasks, we sent them back to police patrol or investigations to do more kind of traditional police work. And so we have been trying to make that change. If you look at really modern police departments, their percentage of their staff that are civilian is above 20%. And so we're still not there, but we made some progress, between 2019 and 2020, and we are hoping to make more progress in these next couple of years. Next, another thing is on overtime spending. This is a good story, I think, to tell. The new commissioner and his team have really made a dramatic reduction in overtime spending. So you can see that the fiscal 19 actual in the little chart below was $48.1 million. And The fiscal 20 actual was $46.9 million. What we were able to do between 20 and 21, though, was put much tighter controls. And again, this was long overdue, we believe, to put much stronger controls on overtime spending to make sure it was only absolutely necessary to fill a critical slot. And the 21 budget went down to 27.2 million, and the 22 budget that was just passed, the budget for overtime is only 22.5 million. Now, from my perspective, there's always going to be some need for overtime because, like I said, if you're short-staffed, you do have to use officers selectively to either fill spots or to do special assignments. But the way we were spending overtime was frankly out of control and was long overdue that we got that fixed. And, you know, to the new commissioner and his team's credit, they took it seriously and got it under control. Next, the last thing I'll mention here is the consent decree. So there are, you know, the consent decree, the public views that as, I think, a good thing, right? We were not compliant. We were violating the rights of some of our citizens, and we needed to have an outside entity, you know, frankly, slap our hand and say, we need to improve this. But the consent decree does come with some cost. So we've had to build a unit within the police department to make sure that we're compliant with those requirements from the federal government. So there's things we have to do in terms of training. You know, the information technology division has had to do upgrades to some of our systems so we can track some of the data better. There's a new unit called the Performance Standards Division that actually, you know, develops policies on how police officers need to interact with the public and what they need to do and make sure we're compliant. We have body cameras, of course, and there's, you know, so those are just some of the examples of the things that the city is paying for because of the consent decree. Those are investments that we've made that we think will help improve the relationship between the police and the community. Just in closing, I wanted to mention two things real quickly before we take questions. One, there's two things that are underway now that I think are important to mention too when we think about public safety. One is call diversion. So the police department, the city, I should say, with the police department in partnership with some other entities, is piloting a program for 911 call diversion. So one of the things we saw that we have seen that you know folks have seen is that there are times when you send a police officer, you know, with a weapon to a scene when it's really more of a mental health problem or some other type of issue. We are piloting that right now. We have a behavioral health organization in Baltimore that is now picking up a small pilot of what we would call mental health distress or behavioral health issue type calls. So we're trying to train our 911 folks to say, if you get a certain type of call, rather than dispatch a police officer, there's another organization that we can call and respond to those calls. Now, should we be shifting money away from police into those types of entities? I would say yes, but at this point, we're still piloting that and making sure that it works. So I think in this year's budget, especially, we heard from a lot of people, well, you should be shifting money from police to other services. Our perspective is you've got to make sure that that works first before you take the money away from the police department. So we've started with a couple of types of calls and to test and see if these other units can handle those responses effectively and quickly. And then the final thing is, you know, we think of police as the only way to solve public safety issues, but that is not, you know, a lot of residents see it that way, but police is not the only thing that we should be thinking about in terms of public safety. We have a program called Safe Streets that's what we call like a violence interruption program that has shown a lot of success. I know the current mayor has interest in kind of expanding that and rolling that out to new, you know, parts of the city. Again, that's something that we have to test and make sure that, you know, make sure those things work and that they're effective before we invest more money in those. But, you know, we strongly believe that those are the right things. We should do as much as we can for prevention first. But just want to acknowledge that in a city like Baltimore, we do have a very high, you know, volume of crime. We get a lot of service calls for requests, and we feel like to make our residents feel safe, we want to at least be able to respond to those calls in a quick time. And part of that is why the budget is so large. So I'll if you could skip ahead, Pedro, I think that's the last. Yeah, we'll definitely pause here for questions, and I'm going to try to go through the chat and answer some things. But if folks want to pop in, I see a lot of questions. If folks just want to chime in and ask, and we can try to address those questions.
Hi, Bob. So I think we're going to I think there are a lot of questions in the chat. And so I'm going to ask Laura to take a quick look at that. And and pick some that have been coming in. But in the meantime, can we, you talked a little bit about this around the budget process, but can we talk about like at what point in the process are most decisions like already made? When for, you know, if we're advocating for something that we want to see obviously included in the budget, where should advocates be in the process to make sure that those things happen?
Yeah, a lot of the decision making I would say is in the winter. So like the January, February time frame, especially, that's when we've gathered all the information, all the requests from agencies, and that's when we're presenting it and discussing it with the mayor and his team. You know, that time that's built into our timeline in April for taxpayers night, you know, I wouldn't dismiss that. I hear a lot from citizens like, oh, we think the budget's already baked at that point. I can tell you for sure that the mayor and his team take that seriously, and we do always have a session with him and his team after the taxpayer night to talk about the things that we heard and decide if we need to respond or change anything. This year we did hear a lot about police, but the decision was that there was no new police services. It was fixed costs that we have to pay, unfortunately. And so when we kind of walked through that with him, the decision was, well, let's stick with what we had because we think that's the right budget. That does not mean that he's not interested in trying to continue to figure out other ways outside of police to do business. Like I said, the diversion program, the 911 diversion program, that's a big deal. That's something that you don't just roll that out, you know, half-heartedly. You have to test it. You have to be committed to it. And like I also said, the violence interruption, you know, focus on safe streets, and there's a new office of neighborhood safety and engagement. There's a lot of investment going on in those areas too. So I would say in the budget that gets presented, a lot of the decisions are made in January and February with my team and me making recommendations to the mayor. So if you really want to get in early, that's when you should be thinking about it. But also, it is fair to say that we do take that feedback seriously in April from those other events. I also mentioned we're trying to do more. The mayor has been real vocal about doing more community involvement in the budget. We're working on a survey right now, which is one way that you can kind of touch everybody. Not everybody maybe, but at least enough that you have a statistically significant sample to know what services people are satisfied with or where they need, you know, would like to see improvements.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and I think she will facilitate this part.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us as speakers this evening and going into detail with us. And we have a lot of questions and comments in the chat. We won't get to all of them, and I'll do my best to summarize. Also, anyone else who's a leader for this evening, feel free to jump in and help me out if you see that that's needed. So a first question that came in, which I think is a good starting point, is the general feeling of the Department of Finance that the current citizen engagement is sufficient, not enough, or too much in terms of the budget process? And I'll kind of add to that, if you have any ideas in your own experience about effective ways for advocates to advocate for certain budget lines, you know, where that would happen.
Yeah, I would say overall, not enough, and we're, you know, cognizant and trying to improve that. I mean, even sessions like this is the first start in that, and trying to educate folks and hear from people what they think. I do think that from an advocacy perspective, you know, the hard thing for a finance department is we're limited in our revenues. So think of last year with COVID-19, we were seeing, you know, enormous drop-offs in things like parking tax and hotel tax and convention center business because of COVID-19. So we were looking for things to cut. And unfortunately, given that environment, we haven't yet recovered from that. We're still like just slowly kind of, you know, bringing our head above water. You know, Pedro, it knows that for sure because he's our revenue director. So, you know, sometimes I hear from a lot of advocates about what we should spend more money on. And there's a lot of things that I would love to spend more money on. I very rarely hear specifics about what we should cut besides generally that we should cut police. I very rarely hear people like really dig into it and say, well, what in police would you really like to go away? You know, things like those two units, the mounted unit or the Marine unit, privately for many years behind the scenes, finance was advocating to get rid of those units because we didn't think they were very effective. And so I think the more the advocates can kind of dig in and really understand like that there are really a couple of key, functions in a police department, one being patrol and two being investigations, investigating and trying to solve crimes, and really put some thought into, like, is it okay? Would you be okay with, if somebody was, breaking into your home, would you be okay waiting 8 minutes rather than 5 minutes for a police officer to show up? Or would you be okay if there was a crime committed and it didn't get solved against you or one of your loved ones? That's the choices that a finance department and the mayor have to consider, because a lot of the volume of the police department budget is kind of call and response. And so I think what I often hear is, like, just generally, like, we shouldn't spend on police, but very rarely do people get into the specifics. So I like to try to educate folks on that, so that, and kind of talk in that level of detail, because those are the choices that we're thinking about. And the more specific that you can be about those things, I think the more credibility those critiques have, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really specific note on the type of language that advocates can use to kind of communicate with your office and other offices on the same page, even if people come from very different perspectives on even the meaning of public safety, as we've seen in the chat.
Right.
Some other questions that came in, I think back to the consent decree, there was a question of if the majority of the consent decree activities that of course are being funded are expected to be permanent, e.g. the info tech division, performance standards, education and training, related to that. If, if relevant, then the drop in education and training from FY21 to 22, and if that's related to the consent decree or not.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, we would expect some of those costs to remain. I think the technology costs are largely implementation costs to put systems in place that can track the type of things that we need to show to be compliant with the consent decree. And I would encourage you, I'm not an expert on the consent decree, but there are, you have to work your way out of being in a consent decree. You have to show that you're compliant. So the consent decree, if folks have read it, it showed a pattern of abuse, basically, that we were not treating people equally. And in order to get out of that, we have to be able to show with data that we are not doing that anymore. So a lot of the information technology costs are one time, because we're implementing systems to put in place that can track that information. The idea is ultimately that a police officer, has something with them, kind of some handheld device, and can kind of enter things directly into that system that talk about the type of call, who they encountered, what happened, and that kind of gets into a centralized system that we can look at and track. I mean, I would think that the performance standards division and the education and training, there was also a lot of upfront costs there where we were building them up. Some of those costs will remain on an ongoing basis, as new guidance becomes available or new training is available. But that is one of the questions was, why did it fall off? There was a big push to kind of do a big level of education and training for our existing police officers. And then going forward, that will be rolled into the academy, that everybody will go through kind of a beefed up curriculum to make sure they're trained to the level that's required.
Thanks. You noted that a large part of the reason that the police budget can be as high as it is locally is that many other things, such as, for example, I know in my case, being in the education system, education is funded through the state versus policing, while controlled by the state, is funded by the city. And a question that came up is, you mentioned that public safety is now sort of starting to include in people's mindset other types of task forces that aren't just police work. And if, community mediation, violence prevention, et cetera, is also not provided by the federal or state governments in terms of funding. At this point, the question that came in is, why does the safety budget not include allocations to these types of programs? And I might kind of also add in, could you see a future where the public safety budget, which again, those types of programs that are not funded by the state or federal level, might include these other types of programs at a much greater level than they do now, to the extent that those are also needed for public safety?
Yeah, I mean, I hope they do. I mean, I think that's something that we are looking at. I would say like Safe Streets, for example, just one good example. It's kind of a form of I wouldn't call it a mediation program exactly, but it is more of an interruption type program. Things like mediation, community-based mediation, I think are good investments. The challenge for us has been, the challenge is always, how do you test those programs to see that they work, and where do you pull the money from, right? And in a city that's as poor as Baltimore is, some of that money would have to come from the police department and kind of shift those resources to those other investments. So I mentioned the things like Safe Streets and like the 911 diversion program, because, we might not see it when you have such a large police department budget, but with the city is testing some of those things. A lot of agencies, a lot of cities around the country are testing those things. And
are those currently part of the public safety budget? So when people talk about, for example, the police budget, would those things be included in it, or are they a separate budget category?
We consider public safety all of that stuff. So even though police and fire are the lion's share of it, most of those programs that you're talking about, they fall under what we call the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And so that when we present the budget and call it public safety, those things do fall under that public safety umbrella.
Great. Jen, what's my time in terms of remaining questions?
We can do about 5 more minutes, and then we need to switch gears.
Another question that came in regards to the general operating budget. What are the prospects to get the larger nonprofits to contribute more to the budget, such as returning to the point that our property tax base is reduced by the amount occupied by said nonprofits? There was a related question in terms of property taxes of, where we're at in terms of collecting taxes from vacant properties. Could you just take a moment and speak to that overall?
Yeah, just in a nutshell, as Pedro shared, nonprofits are exempt from paying property tax. That's in state law, unfortunately. Right. And Baltimore happens to have the disadvantage of we have more nonprofit type entities in our city by far than any other jurisdiction in the state. Nearly 30% of ours is exempt, where I think the closest to that is Montgomery County, which is probably 10 or 12%. What the city has done to partially correct for that is we ask for contributions from the large nonprofits, Hopkins, Morgan State, some of those entities, some of the hospitals, Mercy and others, University of Maryland, big ones in the city that don't pay property tax. It's nowhere near, though, what we get from them is nowhere near what a full rate would look like. We're only getting $6 million collectively in the general fund from those institutions.
Yeah, now, and the question here is, do you see a way to potentially collect more from those nonprofits?
So there's a couple ways. One is you would have to change this. One way would be to change the state law, which is not an easy thing to do. I mean, those institutions are very well organized. I know when I was working on the project to try to reach out to them and generate even that $6 million. They're very powerful full groups. They have, big lobbyists and such that go to the state level and local level and argue the opposite, that they provide a lot of, benefits for local governments or for the city that go kind of uncaptured. It is in our interest to try to get more from those entities, but the best way to do it is a change of state law at the local level. Again, since the law that says that property of nonprofit entities is exempt from property tax, that's a state law. So that's not something that the city can do. We also have an agreement now. The prior administration signed an agreement that was a 10-year agreement that I believe expires in 2026. So we are locked in for the next couple of years, but we will have an opportunity to renegotiate that with those entities at that point. But remember, the city has no authority to compel them to pay based on the state law, unfortunately. So
yeah, no, understood. There's a follow-up question here of if you know of any other cities that have done similar, do you know of any similar cities that have this tax loss that have done work to increase it from those nonprofits?
Yeah,
that's fine, but.
Yeah, we looked when we were negotiating the last round. We looked very closely at Boston. We thought a good model. Now Boston is a wealthier city than Baltimore in a lot of ways, but what they had done, which I thought was pretty interesting, is you know, think about when we go to the nonprofits and ask them for a contribution, you know, it's not meant to be punitive. We're really just asking them to pay their fair share of the services that they consume. And the nonprofits will argue correctly that they deliver some of their own services on their campus. So for example, that some of the nonprofits have their own health services, they have their own you know, trash collection services. So they don't use city services in some ways. Where they do use city services largely is in the public safety realm. So if there's a emergent, you know, like Hopkins doesn't have his own, you know, fire department, so to speak. You know, if there's a fire or an emergency on their campus, the city has to respond. They did look at forming their own police department. They were going to. I think they've now backed off of that, if I'm not mistaken. So the city, if there's a, you know, a serious crime, a violent crime, the city police department has to respond. So what Boston did is they said, look, guys, we're not trying to be jerks here, but look, you consume out of our general fund budget half of the services. You consume those services, and then they worked off of that to kind of back into a like appropriate rate. So rather than saying we're going to charge you the full property tax rate, they said we'll charge you 30% of the property tax rate because you consume 30% of our city funded services. That was the approach that we kind of took in terms of that negotiation. But again, the real challenge there is that even if you have the perfect model of what they should pay, the city doesn't have the means to compel them unless they have either a change in state law or some other way to compel that action.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. We had some great questions here about working on advocacy on specific budget line items, which unfortunately we'll have to wait and get those responses from you after this event because we do need to move on. Thank you so much for answering our tough questions. And I'm going to turn it to Jen to give us a little transition.
Okay.
And if you guys, but before we jump off, I mean, I'll go through the chat while you're moving on to other things. And if there's things we can answer, I'll pop them into the chat if I know offhand. And then if there's anything unresolved, you can send them to us separately and we can reach out, whatever's your preference.
Yeah, I think, Bob, we're going to take the questions from the chat and I think we'll send them to you and Pedro after the fact, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
All right. Just want to pause and say thank you again to Pedro and to Bob. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And have fun the rest of the night. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
So we are going to switch gears in just a second and have Rachel jump in, but are we going to continue to record at this point, or should we?
I think we can stop recording at this point.
Okay.